even when we're looking at psychological development around, especially talent pathway, if it's problem solving, we might be matched up physically or not, because actually I want to expose you that to play against a bigger, taller, stronger player in terms of physicality. Well, how are you going to overcome that in the game? So matched up might not necessarily always be an age or an ability. It might be specifically towards a bio development, a chronological development, or actually, do you know what, I'm going to match up because I know you're good at competitive. We would love to win. Hi, welcome to Coach Cards. My name's Claire, and welcome Ryan and Davies, and we're going to talk about practice design. What's the first thing coaches need to think about when it comes to practice design? I'm going to go to Ryan to answer that question, if that's all right.
Yeah, I think for me, Claire, I think whatever age group or whether it's senior football, professional game, practice design for me goes down to having a clear purpose. You know, really making sure that you know what it is that you want to get out of the practice. I don't know about you two, but for me, I think I probably did it in the wrong order when I first started coaching. And you know, I'd have a game or a practice that, you know, I knew worked and that the players liked, and I'd maybe go to that first and then try and work out what I was going to try and get out of it. Whereas I think, you know, I've hopefully reversed that process now, so that, you know, I've got a clear objective and then I can start to design the practice from there. So I think for me, having a clear purpose of what you want to get out of it is a great starting point for any practice design.
Yeah, great example on that. David, great.
So I guess from my point of view, I guess it really does depend on when the session falls within the week. So what match day it is, the periodisation of the training session. Then I guess you have to have your strong playing principles and then also understand who you're playing against. And then within that design, you have to design sessions that, you know, are relevant to who you're coming up against. Who you have to then obviously make it realistic, and then you have to have loads of repetition in there. And I think once you start to design sessions that you can then make sure you tick all four corners, you know, you make sure you get your physical, your psych, soc, your tech. Once you get all those bits in place, dependent on the day of the week it is, then I think you can start to design a really good session.
Yeah, and I think for me, I think just the fact, because some really good points is about me. So sometimes practice design is making sure that I cover myself as well. So like, am I comfortable to deliver what I'm going to get comfortable, or is it a check and challenge when I'm going to try something out as well? So we're all human beings, and sometimes we can't just switch it on and off, can we?
No, and I think it's, you know, linked to that as well. It's probably having adaptations in your mind as well. You know, depending on, because, you know, every session doesn't go exactly how you think it's going to go, does it? So, you know, having those adaptations in your mind, and, you know, I'm sure we'll talk about ways that we can start to adapt practices, but having that, you know, different things in your locker that you can tap into as you go along. Okay, so what are the different practice types coaches can use, and what returns do they provide? So I think, you know, straight away for me, the practice spectrum that we talk about, you know, stands out straight away in terms of, you know, going from one end of the spectrum of unopposed practices, and then dialing it up to having interference before we then go to, you know, things like your rondos where you overloaded, and then ultimately we want to get to that point where, you know, we're playing matched up, you know, like it would be on a game day. And I think, you know, obviously across that practice spectrum with the players that we're working with, we'll get different returns, you know, from a very, you know, technique focus from unopposed practices right the way up to the, you know, the skill element and the decision making as we go across that spectrum. So I don't know if there's anything, Claire, for you to add to that in terms of, you know, how we expand on that.
Yeah, and I think sometimes as coaches we tend to go to of starting at the bottom spectrum, and I'm not saying bottom as like the trade-off with it, where actually we maybe need to go to the matched up and really kind of get our problems from there to then really either then bring it back to then scaffold if we go forward in terms of learning. But it maybe look messy. Yeah. So at times we need to feel as though we're controlling it, or actually we allow it to be messy or allow it to refrain from the game. So definitely in terms of the types of when we're looking at and working in spectrum order, we like to make it strategic, but actually being messy can be really valuable, and the trade-off we get from that can help us learn in addition to let the players learn as well.
I think as well, particularly in a grassroots setting, you're going to have probably players at very different stages of the development as well. And so, you know, what one practice might not be appropriate for some of the players, and so potentially having parallel activities, and some might be doing some unopposed or slight interference practice, whereas others, like you say, might be able to go straight to the matched up because that's what they're at. And I think it's that skill of coaching, isn't it, in terms of, you know, identifying which players need which, and not a case of everybody starts at this level and we build it up together, but putting players in at the appropriate stage, and that's probably the same, Dave, in the senior game as well.
That was my bit, is just understanding your players, what they need, and challenging them in different ways. And I don't think there's any difference if you're grassroots or first team football. And I think if you can get that, and also variety is key, isn't it? To keep people guessing is actually quite a useful concept in terms of player development, I think.
So, the matchup can be biological, especially when we're looking at that growth development. So even when we're looking at psychological development around, especially talent pathway, if it's problem solving, we might be matched up physically or not, because actually I want to expose you that to play against a bigger, taller, stronger player in terms of physicality. Well, how are you going to overcome that in the game? So matched up might not necessarily always be an age or an ability. It might be specifically towards a bio development, a chronological development, or actually, do you know what, I'm going to match up because I know you're good at competitive. We would love to win. So if we don't like not winning, well, actually that's that matched up psychologically. When we're not winning, how do I help you engage the program as well? So
we used to call it sparring partners. So we would always, so what do you need? So do you need some success? Who that might be? Do you need a challenge? Who are you going to come up against on the weekend? How do we develop if you can't run somebody on the outside? All of a sudden, I'm going to put you up against somebody who's quicker than you, so you've got to practice dribbling inside. And I think to have those within your practice design and across the different types of practices, I think, it's your sparring partners are key. Who you put up against, who and why, I think is a huge part. So, what are invasion game principles, and how can that impact your practice design? Would you like to go?
Yeah, well, I think when we're looking at invasion games, it isn't necessarily the fundamentals of what football is, but actually utilising other invasion games, as we call it. So I want to get into your territory and they want to get into ours, can actually help benefit in terms of formats and rules. So in the environment of Town Pathway, for example, when we're using it from right at the beginning till up to the senior point, it's actually how do we then to get them to understand when and where which bits will come into it. So it's breaking that down. So the simple bit, actually, literally, I want to try to make sure that we're going to invade your territory more than mine, is a real simple way of just looking at, actually, well, we can do that in a tag game. We can do it in other fundamentals of it, just to get them to understand what the game is. As we then add in all the other differentials of the game when we go into youth phase and all the bits of it, if it's an offside, if it's how many goals and what they're scoring. I still think it's really important about that winning aspect of it, because we still want to win the game, but the clarity is about how we win it, and I think that's really key to it.
Yeah, really good.
And I think, any invasion game, it's the same, isn't it? I've got to get past you to get to the other end and score. Now, what that looks like in football, it's a goal. In basketball, it's a basket, whatever that might be. But, fundamentally, to get past the opponent and get to the other end, we're going to need to do very similar things, such as, creating space, being creative, and so those invasion game principles, and probably, particularly in younger age groups where they might be, through school, through different clubs, playing a variety of invasion games, and probably helping the players understand that they can transfer some of those skills that they might be playing or might be using in different sports, and actually help them when it comes to a football environment, because ultimately they've got to get to one end to score a goal or score a point, and making that clear to the players, I think, can only help them in terms of their understanding of football as well as other invasion games.
In the FA, we've got in and out of possession principles. Is that right? Could you expand on them for me, because I'm new, so I need to learn them as well?
Yeah, so I think, in terms of our principles of play as an FA, we really kind of highlight penetration as the key one in possession, because that's ultimately what the sport's about. Can you penetrate the opposition to get to the other end? And I think the other principles, such as movement, creating space, creativity, support, underpin that to be able to allow us as a team to do that. And then obviously on the flip side, Claire, you've got defensive teams, haven't you, who are ultimately trying to use the defensive principles to stop the opposition from doing that? Yeah.
So, and again, it's those fundamentals of each team will do it, whether that's, we've mentioned some of the sports of rugby, we apply pressure. Is it zonal work where they're shifting across, then it's support and it's movement and counterbalance to stop them from you getting in my area. But fundamentally, it's 1v1s, it's 2v2s, it's underloads, it's overloads, and how we match that up is similar to that. And I've done that in the past. I have actually literally put a football team in a netball tournament to get them to understand that invasion games, we have the same transferable skill sets. If they could shoot, we probably would have done really well in that tournament. There is certain skills and techniques that, you know, are evident to that game and that's specific to it. But, you know, fundamentally, they had the transferable of working together, the movement mentioned before when they had possession. It was, you know, they penetrated, they broke lines, they ran forward. They had the athletic ability to it. Psychologically, it was really interesting because suddenly they thought, this isn't my skill set. I'm not a netballer, and I had one netball player officially who played on the team. But actually, once they overcome that, and they realised that they weren't getting told they were great at football anymore, but they did really well in netball, they suddenly realised, oh, it's the same principles. Yeah, okay. And they did really well. So sometimes taking them out their comfort zone, psychologically, to then really mentally stimulate them, can get some really gains back to kind of get them to understand about one, themselves, secondly, each other, and then thirdly, like, well, the netball wanted to steal them, a couple of the players, and I said they can't have them because they're good footballers, and now they do really well. But again, it's just utilising those bits. But again, literally, as we said before, we showed them the fundamentals and the principles about in and out and how they transitioned. If we did it quick and we wanted them to counter-attack really quick. And then the next training session, they suddenly went, we do that at football, this happens. And they complemented it. So it was a really interesting task. Okay, question. How do coaches design effective practices for their players? So we're thinking about, so you mentioned before, David, about sparring, and do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
So at previous clubs, it was really about knowing your players and understanding their strengths, weaknesses, and I think particularly in the senior game, or, you know, particularly high academy or older academy, and the way we've done it before is really study what they need across the four corners, understanding super strengths, and then at that stage is probably also understanding if it's going to stop them getting a job. I think there's the two ends of the spectrum. At that end is what gets you in the team and what keeps you at the club. And I think you probably have to make sure that when you're designing sessions, you're catering for both. So the super strength gets you and keeps you in the team. But if you don't really hone in on the areas of big improvement, that could actually lose you your job at the end we're talking about. Once you understand that, then you understand how your game model works. Now you can start to put in training sessions which improve the team, the unit, and the individual, and having a clear IDP that the player and the coach knows, could go back to, and then can review against. I think that's the best way that we then design practices. Examples we might have, I worked with an outstanding, he's a young England player actually, that we got from a different club, and he found it very, very easy when he first come to our club to go past people, so we'd put him up against the best 1v1 defenders, so he had to come up with different strategies, and we'd have, he wasn't always the best at counter pressing, so we would do possession games with mini goals, so that the second he lost the ball, you know, the team that win it back after scoring a mini goal, so he had to counter press. You actually train that behaviour, and all those things come within knowing him and what he needed to get into the first team. And that's how we start to design effective practices. But it's really about what do the individuals need to keep a job, get in the team. Or
that difference between need and want, isn't it?
There's
a big
it's
difference
huge
to that.
at the highest end. And if you're talking first team football, it's then making sure that people don't lose you the game. So if it's that big a problem, you have to fix it. But you also have to make sure that they can win you a game. And if you're not practicing both ends of the spectrum, and having practice designs which make sure that they're getting loads of chance to practice so that come a Saturday afternoon they can perform, it can ultimately cost you your job.
Yeah, and I think that needs and wants, I can really relate to that specifically within Talent Pathway. If we've got you mentioned about having some really good players, they're all starting a game, so they're always on an equal playing field. Yeah. So then their wants is to be part of a team and they want to start the games. However, what we need to make sure is that we're giving them some difficulty, so actually putting them on the bench or making them finishers, you know, it's kind of a terminology with them to not always have a substitute, but they want to play. So there's a frustration, so sharing to say, look, actually I'm going to bring you on this game because we don't know if we're going to be losing, we're winning, or 0-0, because when you start a game, you always know it's 0-0, so it's quite easy for them to start the game, so that to develop them. And again, exposing into senior football, they're probably going to be a substitute. Yeah. So if we don't expose them into that, so we've got to actually, the game becomes the practice as well.
Yeah.
So the game, we're allowing them to come on and say, right, you're going to come on in 25 minutes, watch, analytically look at the game, where you're going to play, this is where you might play, look at who you're up against. And so that then looks at them and say, well, look, that's 25 minutes of the session. Now you come on and influence and do X, Y, and Z, which again would be linked to them. So it might not be always what they want, what they need going forward as they then transition in from being, an under-16s player to then move into the academy and then into the first team. It has to be exposure, because they have to learn how to come onto that game, and they only might get 15 minutes on that.
And the last bit with probably the men's side is generally young players don't make their debut in their best position. So throughout the pathway, whether you're an under-8 in grassroots football, to play different positions in training and get, again, all part of practice design for what's best for the individual is key, because very few managers are going to trust a little left back, for example. He's going to come on at left wing to start with because it's a touch safer, and then they have to be able to perform to get their second opportunity and earn the trust. So I think in terms of practice design, to make sure that they're playing different positions through the pathway, so when they get their opportunity at the end, they've experienced it more than once, I think is vital if they're going to be successful in grasping opportunity at the end.
I think if we go to the opposite end of the spectrum as well, and look at players who are just starting out, 5 and 6 years old, but what you both highlighted there, it ultimately goes to the same thing. What do the players need? Now, for a 5 and 6 year old, they're probably there at the session because they want to run around with their friends, they want to kick a football, they want to have fun. And so, for me, effective practice design at that stage is, well, are they doing something that they want to do again and come back next week? Because ultimately that's what we've got to ignite, isn't it? That love, that passion for the game, that spirit of football that makes them finish the session and think, oh, I can't wait to go back to football next week. And so that effective practice design is, again, it's what the players need. And, you touched on what they want as well. And I think a lot of time in grassroots, it's, well, they want to have fun. That's the reason that they're there, and that's probably the slight difference between, when you get to a first team environment where, well, we need 3 points on Saturday. Well, that's obviously not what we're going for in grassroots, but that what the players need and what the players want is so vital to make them keep wanting to come back, so that ultimately they fall in love with the game. They want to keep playing it, and you never know, they might one day, be with you, Dave, in a first team environment, and brilliant if we can set them on that journey.
And they should still all enjoy football, whether you're in the first team or you're 5 years old. Football should be fun. It's why we all start out, and I think we can't lose that fact.
Yeah. And I think it's a good question to ask yourself as a coach, isn't it? In terms of, as you've designed the practice and you're delivering it, is if I was a player, would I be enjoying this? Would I want to do this? And if the answer is no, then it's probably, right, I'll probably need to rethink what I'm doing. And I think that's a really important question to ask yourself as a coach, isn't it? Well, if I was a player in this, would I be enjoying it? Would I understand why we're doing it? And I think it's really valuable in terms of,
Probably trade-off, isn't it? Maybe 20% of your session, you might think, okay, there might be some hard work, there might be something that not everybody likes, not everybody, because we can't cater for everyone, can we? But if we get the majority and it's 80%, and fundamentally it's fun, and we all want to take part, and there's smiles, and the best sessions are the ones when you say time, and it's and everyone's upset because you're like, brilliant, you've got that. But I think it's games, isn't it, fundamentally?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier around that clear purpose. Even if it might be really physically demanding and hard work for the players, if they understand why they're doing it and how it's going to benefit them and the team, then ultimately, that's a win, isn't it? Practice
design is all about the why, and there's two bits that people have said to me, and they work really high in senior football or high in the academy. So I believe kids should leave as happy as they arrive. That's when it's been a good session, because if they enjoyed the session, they're happy. They don't want to go, but they're happy because they enjoyed it. And then I think the older you get, of course, there's certain things that players don't want to do. So there has to be an element in any session where there's a little bit that they need, and a little bit they want, and it's the balance of that. And that's no different. Again, if you're a senior manager, there's only a certain amount that you can give the players before it's like, well, they need a little bit for them now to make sure that they really focus on the physical aspect, the tactical aspect, whatever it is. And I think to balance those trade-offs are key. And again, I do believe that's pretty much from 5 years old to 45 years old and everybody in between. Okay. So this one
probably come to you first, Dave, because this, in a first team environment, I would imagine this is common practice in terms of, how have you used game insights to generate content within your practice design, and probably goes a lot to in terms of opposition analysis, in terms of how your practices look in a week building up to a game.
Yeah, so I'd use insights a lot. In fact, I've used it in the last couple of days quite a bit. So I guess let's start with the team. So with the team, the insights we'd use, so when I was at a previous club, we would get a complete data dossier on style in, out of possession and transitions both ways, where they like to deliver, particularly against, they would always do it against teams that played similar to us. You'd then get a breakdown completely on who has the most passing connections between, who loses the ball the most, who's the best in the air, who's not. So we would use and go into vast detail when they score their goals, when they are most likely to concede their goals, the timings of substitutions. So we would look at that. We'd also then get the physical data, so who runs the fastest, we'd probably, if we could, get some injury data, who's had a few knocks and niggles, and we would consider that all within how we plan our game plan. But we would always stick to our principles of play. So we would also then have metrics and feedback about what we do well, where we need to improve, and we would do a 6-week review as a team, and we'd all be given an area. For example, at the club I was at, I would go against the ball, so it would always be out of possession. It would be, what were the areas that we did well, where could we improve, how do we design sessions, and where do we plan them within our periodised month to make sure that the metrics improve next time. The other bit that we used with insights, which I thought this was the most beneficial bit, and the players, particularly under 21s, but even first team, the bit they absolutely loved was their own data back. So against, again, club playing philosophy, what metrics they were hitting. So for example, we were a dribbling club. We liked our number 10s to really ball carry. So how many times they ball carry, how successful they were, what was their end product like. And then we had counter-pressing measures, high press measures, and all those insights just built this unbelievable picture. And it just took away your biases a little bit, because we all have biases. And it just made sure that there was a conscious understanding of actually what was going on in the game. What you have to do with insights is contextualize it. What was the style of the game? So for example, we were a really good high pressing team, but we played against a team that were long ball, so we never got the chance. Our metrics were really down. It wasn't that the players were poor, it was the game didn't allow any real high ball wins. And I think just to understand that, my personal view is that it's an amazing tool and should be used as part of a coaching program. It's not everything, and you shouldn't discard it, because there's some real golden nuggets in there.
I think as well that, our game insights team have done some fantastic work in researching across lots of various tournaments. And, if we take one example around finishing, and, the data suggests of the last couple of major tournaments that the majority of goals are scored between the 6-yard box and the penalty spot with a first-time finish. Now, if we take that and then you maybe look at some of the finishing practices that you might see in clubs, how often do they actually reflect that? Certainly, you might see a finishing practice and it might be, they receive the ball outside the box, have a touch and then have a shot. Whereas, they're probably in a game not going to get many opportunities throughout a season to be in that position. Whereas, can we use that insights to then say, right, well, can we design our practices so that they're getting lots of opportunities for a first-time finish within the box? But then again, going back to what you said there, Dave, around context, well, the lower down the age groups we go, that's probably going to change, isn't it? Yes. Because they probably haven't got the capabilities at 6-7 years old to do a first-time finish. So it's probably going to be more that they're dribbling the ball and then shooting. So, it's probably using the data, but then actually digesting it and making it appropriate for the age group and stage that you're coaching at that time. So I know something I've done as well, because obviously in a first-time environment, when you've got access to analysis and a team around you, even in like grassroots settings. So in the past, I've got those who are substitutes to just have a look at opposition and right, can you look at any patterns? How do they play out from the back? When we've scored, where are we scoring our goals from? And over the season, you start to develop this little kind of, informal data bank, if you like, of us and opposition. So when you come to play them again, well, we know that they've got this pattern when they play out. And so I think even without, video analysis, we can still, utilise, maybe the resources that we've got to help us generate some information, which can then ultimately, during the week, help us to inform our practice design.
Yeah, so I think it's important using data insights for now, isn't it? So it will help around. So if it's, for example, going back to the finishing and building on that, we're using every goal scored as 1 in 8 currently in the tournament, and it's great to get themed work from that. But then why do we allow players to practice with 20 footballs? So if we start to move up a little bit, like I said, the age and age-related in stage, well, I might give a bag of 20 to the 10, 11, 12, 14-year-old even at a point. But actually, when we're looking at winning and scoring goals, I might now say, you only got 8 balls and you must score. So starting to think about how we manage and practice the design and what we're going to use to really match stress them to do that, because they're only going to get 8 footballs. Or they're going to get 8 chances in the game. So why are we giving them 16 in practice to that? The next bit obviously is then future balling it. And future balling meaning I've got this future ball, what is the game going to look like in 10 years' time? So if I've got a player who's 12 and they're in and around a talent pathway, or if they're coming through into the game, I'm not producing them for the game now, but actually what the game is going to be like. And you can go really specific to goalkeepers, for example, 5 and 10 years ago. Where they are now, they are distributors who can handle the ball. So again, we're looking at where are the themes of the games and insights that we're using now, but then potentially where will the game go and change into? And especially the women's game, as we're still evolving, we're only just 10 years plus just of a full-time professionalisation within our country. Everyone's catching up, so the game's still going to evolve, and we're still going to get different things. So what are the tool set are we going to give the players when we're producing curriculums or periodisation plans, what they're going to need for the future of the game that's going to come, and to help them be a club player or whatever potential they want to be. And like I said, they will always start in grassroots, they will always come through from somewhere, but again, fundamentally, it's what it is, but then what it isn't as well, because it's allowing them to be expressive. To data is what it is, and it's numbers, and it's quantifiable, and it's great, and it's objective. But actually what it isn't is the fun, the enjoyment, the variability of actually of who you are, because you're different to what was coming to you as well. How can coaches adapt practices to better meet the needs and wants of their players? Are there any tools or thinking methods they can use to do this? Ryan, you got some top tips on this?
Yeah, I think, straight away, in answer to that question, I think the step principles are a key one for coaches to go to. So, adapting the space, changing the task, adapting equipment, or altering what the people or the players are doing within the practice. So I think, having that in the back of your mind, because, particularly for the coaches in grassroots, I think that there's always going to be those times where, they might have a player who finds something a little bit too easy, or another player who needs a little bit more support because what you've set's a bit challenging, and it can probably be a case that, right, well, we might just make the space a little bit bigger. So if they're struggling to control it straight away and they're losing possession every time because it's a really tight area, well, if you make it a bit bigger, then it takes a little bit of the pressure off them. Again, it might be a case that, we change the size of the football, or we, for a player who's just starting out, we might use a futsal so it doesn't bounce off them as far. So adapting the equipment. We've talked about, the practice spectrum and changing the people. So, I'm thinking about the team I coached last year, and we had a player who, when we were doing one-on-ones, a one-on-one for her was a 1v3 because she was technically and skillfully good enough, and that was the challenge that she needed. Whereas for others, they might be overloaded and have a 2v1, so adapting the people. So I think, having the step principle in mind, and, that goes back to your planning, doesn't it? In terms of, right, well, this is the practice that I want to put on because I want to achieve this, but these are some of the adaptations that I might use to either increase the challenge or support individuals if that's needed. So I suppose, Dave, Claire, the key to using the step principle and adapting activities is knowing when to do that, and using your observational skills as a coach and stepping in at the appropriate time. So any thoughts on when is the appropriate time, and how you would know that it's the time to adapt the activity or the game that you're playing?
Senior football, you just see they're getting too much success, and then it's time to ramp up the challenge. And I guess if you're getting no success, then it's time to alter pitch sizes, whatever that looks like. I guess that would be the way that...
It's knowing what success is.
Yeah.
So again, going back to probably planning, like what is it? What's the measurable outcome that we need to kind of, what's a challenge? So if the challenge for you, like we said before, you might need it to be dribbling. If you're defending, I'm going to put you two together. So actually, but if you're getting passed too many times, well, it might be something that I might go to you and say, well, what would be more challengeable for you? What might you need? You might ask me for another player and make it underloaded and overloaded, or it might be a different skill that you want to try and practice, or using your other foot, or going a different way. Is it a different way of supporting it? So sometimes going to the players themselves might be helpful in terms of that player ownership to go, because they know themselves. They know, got a bit more self-aware, and the challenge is always themselves. If they get past you once, well, actually, can you get past 5 times now? What are you doing after you get them past with them? Is it a little mini goal? Is it something else? So it's the challenge, and sometimes it might also be the reverse of the cheat. And the cheat might be actually because you were 2v1, but actually, no, I need to be 2v1 the other way around now. So it's not necessarily a cheat. It's at that moment in time I might need a bit of success, because motivationally you switched off now because you haven't had a lot of success for a while.
And I think when you're looking at players' body language, that'll tell you whether it's going really well, it needs to change. Poor kids or even adults, once the shoulders start to slump, it's time to give them a little bit of help, or come up with a new constraint, a challenge, or something to just try and manage that, because we've all seen it where somebody's getting ruined or having too much success, where actually it's time to just bring them down a little bit. I think probably looking at body language is a good key to whether it's time to tweak the practice. How do coaches ensure their practice design links to match day?
I think it's the importance of, we've touched on before, about periodised plans. What is the match? What's the outcome of the match that they're going to use as well? So is it a training? Because the match is fundamentally, it's the best bit that the kids will see in terms of they want to play football and they want to play on that, whether it's a Saturday or it's a Sunday. But fundamentally, it'll be of a whole process where learning happens, and generally it's not just. I don't want to say winning is a bad word at times, because winning can be great, and it is about an invasion game that we are scoring more goals than the other team, so it's still important. But I think the outcome of how we win and when we win and what we're doing, it needs to be valued. It needs to be valued and shared across again. And as we touched on before, about passing it to parents and to players about how we're going to play today, and we're going to put the theme that we've used the week, what we've been working on, if it's 1 session, if it's 3 sessions, if a block of work we've been working on as well. What's the outcome? Is it where I might have changed position? I'm going to have a different way of looking at things. So I think it's the whole practice element of it. It's the big picture. It's the big picture in terms of how they apply what they've learned and what they've done.
Really good.
I think one of the challenges potentially for grassroots coaches in terms of aligning training to match day is potentially the space looks very different. It might be 11 aside on a Saturday morning, but they might only have a third of a 3G pitch. And so I think it's, being creative with your practice design. And I know certainly when I've coached and only had a third for some weeks, I've spoken to the teams who are on the other thirds, and we've gone lengthways instead of across, just so we can get some longer range passes and work on some of those more direct balls and things like that. So I think it's, trying to use the resources that you've got to try and replicate some of the match day conditions that you're going to plan for as closely as possible.
Yeah, and I think probably from my experience, so you plan in the week, you come to a Saturday. If you're really good, the opposition completely change what they do to try and stop you, and you just have to have some what ifs. And I think over a period of time, you should build a bank of knowledge of how to deal with many things, and then the success will be that they can adapt and problem solve and slightly tweak within your principles and your framework, and have a successful Saturday afternoon. And I think that's why having clear principles and practicing them all the time, I think would then mean that if a team turn up, whether it's grassroots or first team, and completely change because you've got really good, your players are able to adapt without loads of screaming and shouting from the side. I think that would be useful, and it's a good marker of whether they understand what you go after.
So this one's looking at different areas of the game. So any advice you would have to help coaches with practice design when working with specific groups? So come to you first, Dave. So any considerations when working specifically with adults?
Yeah, I think it's to have a good session. I think it's really quite simple. So I think it's the 3 R's. So it's relevant to the players, realistic to the game, and they get lots of chance of repetition, lots of similar actions. And I think when you're designing a session and you're reviewing the session afterwards, I think it's just as important. Have they hit the 3 hours? And I think if they have, then they're going to get better over the period of time. And I think I would really keep it very, very simple in terms of if you could tick those 3 boxes with every session, then you're doing pretty well with your coach design.
Fantastic. And anything to consider from a female game perspective?
Yeah, I think the clear thing is the game, the similarities to the games. So the game is the game that we play. So I think in terms of when we're looking at the subtle differences, if it's the adult bit, but the main key thing when it does change is in the youth phase. And I think whether it's still boy and girl, we need to understand their emotional development as well as the physical development of when basically pubescency and maturation happens. So I think it's just clear again about talking to players. We're probably going to have some adaptations. We may not always have the players that we're going to have. So I think adaptability is probably a key coaching skill you're going to need for 12 to 16-year-old, because your planned session of having so many numbers there and suddenly they turn up and they're moody or growth's going on and they need a little bit of adaptation. I think in terms of the sessions itself, you have to be a little bit pre-planned for that age group, knowing what they're kind of going through both physically and mentally.
And I think, you know, it's similar when we go to, you know, 5 to 11s, 12 to 16s. For me, it's understanding why the players are there. And I think particularly as they get older in, you know, secondary school, 12 to 16s, you know, some of them might have aspirations to go into the professional game. Some of them might just be there because they want to have a kick around with their mates and it's a break from the, like say, exam pressures or whatever it might be. And I think understanding that can really help in terms of our practice design. And then going back, like we said previously, to the younger age groups, you know, for me, success in terms of practice design for the youngest ages is, do they enjoy it and want to keep going back? And is it something that, you know, makes them fall in love with the game? So I think, you know, they're really understanding why your players are there can really help with that practice design. And then I think even again going into, you know, disability football, which some of the coaches will be working in, and that step principle, and, you know, really having those adaptations and speaking to the players about, well, what can I do to help you because of the need that you have is really key. So, you know, those relationships with players and getting their insights can really help at any age, I think, in terms of that practice design. Yeah,
and I think just very quickly as well, some of the answers are already there. You don't have to come up with the answers. So going to schools, or linking back to a bit about disability, if it's neurodiversity now that we're linking them, there will be set strategies that are already in place by education, so the parents will know as well. So you don't have to come up with the ideas. They're probably already formulating there. And don't forget, they're coming to you, that they like enjoying coming to you. So you've got a bit of the first win anyway.
Last question. To wrap up this discussion, what are your quick fire top tips to help coaches with practice design? Ryan, do you want to take us away?
Yeah, I think for me, the top tip I'd say is just having a real clear objective as to what you want to get out of the practice, because if you've got that clear objective, then the practice falls out of that. So that'd be my top tip.
Top tip in terms of practice design, definitely look at your going into outcome, but then really looking at measurable. You know, what is it you're looking at? And the answers can be from players. I think you don't have to come up with it all the time. So they'll be a great resource.
And I guess my top tip, coming from working day to day, every single day with players, is I don't think you have to reinvent the wheel. So I don't think you have to come up with a brand new sparkly session every time. There could be lots of similar sessions with slight tweaks, and I think players get better when there is the repetition without it being exactly the same. And I think if you can strike that balance between not coming up with real random different sessions all the time, but similar themes along working towards your main principles, I think then you'll see improvement in players.